Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. David Detmer, to talk about Pink Floyd. Dr. Detmer, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I know that you have a Ph.D. in philosophy from Northwestern. You teach philosophy at Purdue University Northwest. You've written about Richard Rorty and Jean-Paul Sartre and Jürgen Habermas. But you've also written about Pink Floyd. So what is it about Pink Floyd that attracts your attention?
Well, you know, we in philosophy, we like to stick our noses into everything. And so I do like to write about other subjects, including music, because I love music, and I'm an amateur musician and guitarist, as I know you are as well. And so Pink Floyd, I think, is a really interesting band. Lyrically, I think there's some philosophical content in their work, and that's part of what I've written about. And one thing that I find really interesting about them, more so than most bands, is I think they've taken pains to make the music help to convey the musical message. Yeah. And so that's one thing I've written about in the pieces I've written on Pink Floyd.
I always thought that one of the reasons they were unique is that they weren't part of the industry for so long. They were making these odd albums. Yes. And they had a niche, and they had a small audience that was following them, and then when they broke, they were something completely different. Nobody expected Dark Side of the Moon when Dark Side of the Moon came out. Yeah. What do you think about that?
Back in the 60s and even into the early 70s a little bit, record companies didn't really understand rock music. I mean, the executives didn't. And so they tended to put anything out there and see if it sticks. So whereas now there's all kinds of
forms, for instance.
right. And so they did have their niche. So you're right, they weren't big sellers, but they were able to attract an audience. And it's interesting to me how the stuff they were doing in the early days, they still kind of brought it to bear when they made their breakthrough with Dark Side of the Moon. Because in the early stuff, as you know, it tended to be kind of spacey and improvisational and atmospheric, not terribly melodic, not a lot of hooks.
Yeah. But a lot of atmosphere.
A lot of atmosphere. Yeah. And so then, when they finally kind of developed as songwriters to the point where they could write good melodies, which pretty much was around the time of Dark Side of the Moon, they were able to use what they had learned about atmosphere to really enhance the message they were getting across with the music. Yeah. Another thing that helped is, unlike their earlier albums, they did the Dark Side of the Moon material live for about a year before they recorded the album.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and they refined it. They'd sort of see what was working and what wasn't working, and they refined it.
Obviously, there are things on that album that they couldn't have done live.
But
the songs, basically.
The songs, that's right. Yeah. And so you're right, when they did the album, they had all sorts of sound effects. They obviously couldn't do that live. Yeah. And they did interviews with people. They brought people in and would ask them questions about stuff. And if you listen carefully to the album, from time to time you can hear little voices kind of in the background saying things. Yeah. And that helped with the atmosphere of what they were doing. So, like, for example, there's a song on there called "On the Run," early on the Dark Side of the Moon. It's the fast synthesizer instrumental piece. Yeah. And so you might not know what it's really about. It's just this sort of fast, hectic instrumental. But you can hear in the background comments about luggage and your flight. And so then you realize, it's somebody frantically trying to catch a plane. And then there are also some subtle passages in there about dying. They're sort of almost barely perceptible. And that goes along with this theme about maybe sort of the fear people have of flying. And it goes along with the whole theme of the album about the various pressures of life and things people are afraid of. But one other thing I wanted to address in what you were saying, about sort of the record executives and so on. Yeah. After they had this huge success with Dark Side of the Moon, you may recall that in their next album, Wish You Were Here, there's a song, Have a Cigar, where they mercilessly go after these record executives. Right. Lines about, we can make this into a monster if we all pull together as a team. Yeah. And by the way, which one's pink? They sort of don't know what's going on.
That's a great lyric.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting. But so, let's look at that early trajectory for a little bit, though. Syd Barrett was initially part of the band.
Yes, Syd Barrett was in fact the leader of the band in the early days. He was the main songwriter, he was the lead singer, he was the lead guitarist. So he was the leader in every sense.
And this is starting when through?
Oh, I want to say, 67, 68, something like that.
Yeah.
So basically their first album, and I think a song or two on the second album, he was the leader at that time.
Okay, so not for very long then.
Not for very long. He descended into madness very rapidly. He was, by all accounts, at one point, a charming, intelligent, articulate person. And then he started doing things like sometimes he would stand on stage in a catatonic state and not play a note. Or he would play a song that's different from what the other band was doing. And just other indications that his mind was going. He was also a heavy drug user, which may have contributed to this.
Triggered problems.
And so eventually he was essentially ejected from the band. And there's a famous story. They never formally fired him. What happened was one time when they were getting ready to go to a gig, one of them said, "Should we bother to pick up Syd?" Said, "No, what's the point?" And so and that was pretty much it. They stopped picking him up.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's very clear that they really loved him and really missed him. And so the album "Wish You Were Here" is largely about that. The sort of directing that at Syd Barrett. We wish you were here. It's a tragedy. Yeah. And in the song "Brain Damage" from Dark Side of the Moon, that's a song about the fear that one might go mad because they had seen
the one with the lyric about the newspapers.
The
The lunatics, but the lunatic is in my head is the final line there.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. So do you happen to know the name of the album that he is the singer on? Which one was it? Probably something I never heard of.
Let's see. It's not "Saucer Full of Secrets." That's the first one. It escapes me at the moment.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I mean, there's like something about "Careful with That Axe, Eugene."
Oh, that's a song. Careful with that.
Oh, isn't that the name of an album?
No,
okay.
that's a song, right?
All right. Yeah. And then they, what's that?
"Piper at the Gates of Dawn." That's the first album.
Oh,
Came
is it
back to
really?
me. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
"Piper at the Gates of Dawn."
Okay. I'll try to look that up.
Yeah.
Okay. So actually, they did a few albums without him then before they got to Dark Side of the Moon.
Quite a few. Yes.
Okay.
Quite a few.
All right. And then, well, as long as we're on Syd Barrett, what became of him?
Oh, that's a good question. He did make 2 or 3 solo albums, even after he had gone mad. So I take it he must have had some good days and some bad days.
Yeah.
And in fact, some of the Pink Floyd people did help him and appeared on some of those solo albums. They're very quirky. His sensibility very much went in the direction of quirky, psychedelic pop songs. Not much is known. I think these were made all maybe in the early 70s, if I remember correctly. And I think not much is known about his life after that. He's dead now, but he lived a good long while. I think it was in this century that he died. I don't remember the exact year. But here is a really creepy story about Syd Barrett. While the band Pink Floyd was making the album, "Wish You Were Here," they hadn't seen Syd in years. At one point, a visitor came to the studio, and they're saying, who is this guy? Who is this fellow? And finally one of them said, I think that's Syd. And his appearance had just completely changed. It's like he had lost his hair, he had gained a lot of weight. I think he'd shaved off his eyebrows or something. There's a photograph where he really looks like an alien. He looks really strange. And evidently, he kind of acted like he was a member of the band. He was saying, well, do we need to do another take? And things like that. And they kind of didn't know how to interact with him, and then he kind of shuffled off after a while. So that was sort of the one encounter they had with him, after he was going.
Sort of a Yoko Ono experience, That's cool.
Yeah.
So you, in your article that you published about this, what did you focus on?
I focused on the theme of alienation and the pressures of life. So one thing that happened starting with Dark Side of the Moon and really continuing through the next 3 albums, "Wish You Were Here," "Animals," and "The Wall," is they were all sort of conceptual albums, not just a collection of songs, but there was a kind of theme to them. And in Dark Side of the Moon in particular, I think the main theme, and this is not just my theory, Roger Waters, who was the lyricist, this is pretty much what he says as well, It was about the things that people are afraid of, the things that people feel pressure about, things people are alienated from.
Yeah.
So
That's really fascinating because that album doesn't seem to be about anything, you know, the first couple times you hear it, but you still sense that it holds together. All of those songs have something in common, and you can't initially put your finger on it, but that's interesting to hear that explanation. That makes perfect sense.
Right, well, and the lyrics, this is another change they had made. The lyrics they had done prior to Dark Side of the Moon tended to be pretty abstract, not totally clear.
Yeah.
And Roger Waters, who was the lyricist for the band, he made a major effort to write lyrics that would be clear and open to comprehension. And so, take a song like Time, for example, on Dark Side of the Moon, where, it starts out talking about, you are young and life is long, there is time to kill today, fritter away the hours in an offhand way.
Yeah.
And then suddenly it turns in this dark direction. Then one day you find 10 years have got behind you. No one told you when to run. You missed the starting gun. And then as soon as you hear that ominous line, 10 years got behind you, you missed the starting gun, boom, David Gilmour comes in with a solo. Yeah. And so you have this long, expressive solo. And I think the way it works, if you've been listening to the lyrics, is you meditate about that message, that scary message, while you're listening to the music. And so then when he was done with this remarkable solo, you run and you run to catch up with the sun, but it's sinking, coming around, to catch up behind you again. Yeah. So there's this idea of time just racing by and you're losing this race. And I think it's interesting that he wrote that as such a young person because...
How old was he?
Well, he would have been in his 20s.
Still in his 20s,
I think still in his 20s. Yeah. Because you and I are old enough to know, I hope you'll agree with me on this, the older you get, the faster it seems to go.
Oh, absolutely.
So he was onto that way back then.
What other concepts do we associate with the other albums? I Wish You Were Here, I guess that was sort of a homage to Syd Barrett, or?
Well, it was partly an homage to Syd Barrett, as you say. They wished he was here.
Yeah.
But Roger Waters has also said the band was starting to get alienated from each other and feeling like they weren't connected. And so his idea was he was sort of saying to his bandmates, I wish you were here. And he didn't mean it in a finger-pointing way. He meant to include himself in this, I wish I were here with you as well. And part of
these songs are sort of about consciousness, aren't they?
In a way.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Go ahead, but yeah.
Well, yeah, so I think that's kind of an interesting thing about what was going on. I think this is something that happens often. An individual or a group of individuals struggle, and then they achieve success. It can kind of cause problems. It's like, they were struggling to try to make a breakthrough. And suddenly they had this spectacular breakthrough. I think, as you said, Dark Side of the Moon was this hit album for years. It was just on the chart for an incredible amount of time, preposterously successful. And now they have to do a follow-up. And it's like with that success, they got money, they got fame. You kind of lose your hunger to do something new. And now there's this pressure to do something new. So they're kind of... I need your help to do this thing, but they're kind of off on their own wavelength. So that was a big part of what that was about. And so then the themes of the other animals, so Animals, which was the one after Wish You Were Here, that was largely inspired by Orwell's book Animal Farm.
Oh,
and
really?
and that was more political. So it's got songs about pigs, dogs, and sheep, and these are used as kind of metaphors for different kinds of people. And the scariest one is about dogs. So this is about people sort of at the top of the food chain who just prey on others who are. Bosses preying on workers, that kind of thing. There's a kind of a left-wing political slant to it. Yeah. And then The Wall was largely about, again, alienation, which I think was one of Roger Waters' major themes. So the alienation of the audience from the band, this whole thing about celebrity getting in the way, about how, he talks about how, why do people want to spend all this money to come to a concert, and then they're hooting and hollering throughout it and not even listening to the music.
Yeah.
You're like, well, it's sort of all about they want to be in the presence of these famous people who have made these albums. So it's not really a human situation where there's communication.
And that's a good observation. I
Yeah.
know from being in the Louvre, most of the people there walk up in front of the famous picture and take a selfie and walk away without looking at it.
Exactly.
Interestingly, I saw them when they did the Animals tour.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, and I didn't know, I knew who they were. I'd never really listened to their music, but Yes was opening for them, and I wanted to hear Yes, and a friend of mine was going to see Pink Floyd.
Well, that's quite a bill, Yes and Pink
Floyd.
Yeah,
and so I went with him, and we were in Soldier Field, and we get there, and they've got these big pigs.
Yeah.
Like, now they make big balloons about all kinds of things, but I never saw anything like this. Like 4 big pigs floating around the edge of Soldier Field, and they had this big round screen, and that intrigued me. And then they did Dark Side of the Moon. So my exposure to Dark Side of the Moon was live at Soldier Field.
Wow. Yeah.
And then I recently found out they only did those shows once. They would go to a town and they'd take all this time to set up that show, and they'd do one show maybe, and then they'd leave. So they were almost as interested, it seemed to me, in the production of that show as they were in making the albums.
Yeah, I suppose that's right. I think that only happened after they achieved that spectacular success with Dark Side of the Moon. I mean, they used to play in pubs.
Yeah, right, because people weren't coming out to see them.
Yeah, that's right. I think I remember reading that when they were touring The Wall, they had 3 complete sets.
Yeah.
So what would happen is there's one set that they're using that night. There's another set they're setting up in the next town, and they're still breaking down the set from the previous town. Those sets were so huge they had to do it that way. Yeah, so that's another thing about some of the rock bands of that era. There was this element of excess, excess and spectacle.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about one of the rumors here. I've been told that if you start the album, I think when the credits start at the beginning of Wizard of Oz, and you turn the sound down on the movie, that it's a soundtrack for the movie.
Yeah, I think that's just a coincidence. If you do that, there'll be things like, when the house with Dorothy in it lands, right at that moment, the music ends also. It happens like the musical transitions sort of correspond with what's going on, but it's just a coincidence.
There's no evidence that they had that in mind.
Yeah. I mean, it's people with too much time on their hands,
right.
trying these things out.
But on the other hand, if I heard that they did that, it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I suppose. But I mean, first of all, the movie is a lot longer than the album, and some of the correspondences aren't really all that strong.
So you've really investigated this.
I investigated it.
That's why you're a professor. Yes.
Yeah.
You've looked into it.
Yeah.
So what other interesting things did you observe about Dark Side, or about any of these albums?
Well, I think one point that I talk about, I've got another article that's going to be coming out in a Routledge publisher companion to Pink Floyd, and in an essay I wrote for that, I talk about how their music helps them get their message across. And so one of the points that distinguishes Pink Floyd from other so-called progressive rock bands is almost all of their pieces are very slow. They like a very leisurely pace. Whereas a lot of rock music, as you know, tends to be very up-tempo and sort of full of energy.
Right.
And when you have that really slow, leisurely pace, it's easier to absorb everything that's going on. You can hear the words, you can hear the sound effects they use, you can hear the sort of spoken voices and so on. And also, I think there's a sense in which it's more inviting. There's more of a sense that there's an attempt at communication, because when you have the music rushing by really fast, then it's just a question of sort of trying to catch up, whereas here you can kind of relax and absorb it all. And I talk about this in the context of progressive rock, because that is, at least now, I think, the most despised genre of rock music among critics. There's this. Sorry.
Let's define that a little bit.
Yeah.
What are some examples?
So progressive rock, that's usually thought to include bands like, you mentioned Yes, King Crimson, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Pink Floyd, early Genesis, not the Phil Collins stuff with all those hits in the 80s, the early stuff with Peter Gabriel, bands like that. And critics tend to call that music pretentious, bombastic, elitist, etc.
So this is because punk came along
Well,
and drove things in the other direction, I think.
That certainly is part of it. But I think the idea is some people have the idea, including a lot of critics, that rock music is supposed to be sort of simple and fun, easy to play, easy to listen to. And so the hallmark of progressive rock, obviously, it's like it's a rough and ready, loose sort of term, but it refers to rock music that is longer, more complicated. It has tempo changes, it has key changes, it has dynamic changes, loud electric passages and soft acoustic passages and so on.
Stuff that was very popular in the late 60s.
Right.
The revolutions here and things like that.
And progressive rock was hugely popular also in the early 70s, but now there's been this critical backlash against it. So almost all of those bands take something of a critical bashing. And Pink Floyd, less so than the others. There's, like, I think Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols used to have a T-shirt that said, "I hate Pink Floyd." So Pink Floyd was part of this. But I think one reason why they haven't taken it as, they haven't had such a critical bashing as the other bands had, is that because it is so slow, such a leisurely pace, you can actually hear all of that stuff happening. You can whereas if you have a bunch of key changes and tempo changes and dynamic changes rushing at you really quickly, some people find it sort of assaultive. It's like, because already, the music is complicated, I can't sort of follow it all and so on. Now, I personally really like progressive rock. It's by far my favorite genre of progressive rock, so I'm not here to bash it, but I think that's part of the explanation as to why Pink Floyd has fared better with the critics than those other bands have.
Yeah. So there's a poetic quality to the lyrics, and I'm sure you must have addressed that to some extent. But you also are looking at how this plays with the music that's accompanied with it and the sound effects.
Let me give you an example, if I may.
Yeah.
So the song "Money," which is one of their few hit singles, was a big hit single in the 70s. It's on Dark Side of the Moon. Well, it's in septuple meter. It's in 7/8 time. Now, there's a David Gilmour guitar solo that's in 4/4 time in the middle, but most of it's in 7/8 time. Now, why is that significant? Well, if you listen to the lyrics, on the surface, it looks like it's a celebration of the acquisitive life. You got to grab that cash with both hands and make a stash.
But it's ironic.
Keep your hands off of my stash, et cetera, et cetera. And it sort of makes fun of redistributionists and socialists and everything. So it sure looks like it's very much in favor of being rich. Well, how do they undermine this? How do they sort of make it clear that it is a bit satirical? That 7/8 meter is one of the things that does it, because rock music audiences, they're used to that steady pulse, that steady 4/4 beat. And here, it's like every other beat is accented. So beat 2, 4, and 6 are accented. So your body is feeling, okay, I want an accent on beat 8, but it doesn't happen.
It leaves you hanging.
Because then you get beat 7, which is unaccented, and then beat 1 is unaccented. So they do little tricks like that. So
it's like saying something and then saying not when you're done.
So even if somebody doesn't really know a lot of music theory and they don't pick up on that, you can kind of feel it bodily. And then also another part of progressive rock is the idea that the unit is the album rather than the individual song. So when you look at how the song "Money" is situated on the album, there are all these other songs about the pressures of life. Time, "The Great Gig in the Sky," which is about death, "Brain Damage," which is about mental illness, "Us and Them," which is about different kinds of people clashing. So all of these things are about unpleasant things to fear. Then you've got money stuck in the middle. And so you ask, well, is money going to solve any of these problems? Obviously not. So then that leads to the interpretation, the need for money, the quest for money, the lust for money, that's another one of these problems of life. So the musical elements are part of what gets that message across.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. David Detmer for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.